I like, which isn't for everybody, but I really like it.
So I'm gonna get us started, guys, because they're pretty late. They're already starting. Hello, buonasera. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. We didn't expect such a lovely full house. So we're going to have a conversation, which is actually going to be very conversational. And we'll do that probably for about 35 or 40 minutes. And we will allow questions, but we can't pass the mic around or have you take your mask off. So if you could ask a question, I will then repeat it to make sure everyone can hear it and for the stream. So we're here to talk about how to do new stuff. And in short, how to innovate, what role innovation plays in newsrooms. It's a very buzzy topic. It's also a very fraught topic. It's something that a lot of newsrooms, large and small, have to think about. They're sometimes not quite sure why they have to think about it, but they feel the pressure to think about it. It can also be really exciting. To a lot of people, doing innovation and being on the forefront of innovation means experimenting and being creative and being able to have the fun of inventing the future of journalism. But the reality, more than ever, is a little bit mixed, as always. And doing innovation is important, as we know, to be able to get out in front of what is a really rapidly transforming world of journalism. And all of us have played different roles in that. And in fact, some of the media are probably the products of innovation that didn't even exist 10 years ago. And Doug will tell us about that. But increasingly, there are also challenges around resources. How do you do innovation when you don't have a lot of them? There are challenges around business models. How do you do innovation or be ambitious and be mission-driven and also make money if you need to? These are all complicated questions. So we are fortunate to be joined today by people who have a lot of experience answering these complicated questions. So without figuring out the answers to any of them, but really sharing experiences about different ways to do innovation today and why we do innovation at all, we've assembled a panel of people who bring very different perspectives. To my right, we have Robin Kwong, who is the new formats editor at the Wall Street Journal. Just to my left, Doug McRae, who is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Pop-Up Magazine Productions. You'll tell us a bit more about what that is later. And at the other end, we have Chris Moran, who is the head of editorial innovation, the only one with innovation in his title, at The Guardian. So different publications, some legacy print, but with a very different business model from the Financial Times, where I come from. I'm Renee Kaplan. I'm the head of digital editorial development there, and the Wall Street Journal, which is similar-ish to the Financial Times, but very different in how we move forward. So hoping to sort of present different pictures. Did somebody laugh when I said that? Yeah. So I kind of want to start off, actually, before getting into the more conversational bit, with actually asking each of our panelists to describe what they do, because oftentimes our roles and our titles are quite obscure. Like, actually, what does that mean? Certainly, I spend a lot of time explaining it to my friends, my parents, my colleagues. And it is probably a reflection a lot of how we do innovation. And so I'll just ask each of you one by one, maybe not too long, but just a couple of minutes to explain sort of what you do and how innovation actually fits into what you do. Maybe I'll start over on your end, Chris. And I'm sorry, I should have given you fair warning.
No, that's cool. So I'm Chris. Yes, my job title is Head of Editorial Innovation. I got to that role primarily through starting out as the first audience editor for The Guardian. And in doing that job and building that team, I built a product called OFAN. I was the co-creator of it, along with a developer called Graham Tackley. And that's The Guardian's real-time data tool. And in doing that, I guess I learned a huge amount about kind of how audiences come to us, how they stay with us, but also about the link between editorial and product and engineering and how that can work well. So my focus is not so much I think, similar to Robin's, which is kind of has a more format space. I'm not the head of visuals or anything like that, thank goodness. But my major focus is on trying to build a bridge between editorial and product and weaving them together to get the best out of both of those things.
Sorry. Thank you, Chris. Doug.
I used to be a magazine journalist and a radio journalist, and with some friends, we started something that we imagined would be a live magazine, which was basically writers, radio producers, photographers, filmmakers performing new, mostly reported stories live on stage. It started out as a hobby, but it quickly took over our lives, and we turned it into a company where now we have productions that tour North America, perform in big historic theaters for 2,000 and 3,000 people a night. And the idea is basically journalists go out, stand at a mic, perform a story, we animate them, we photograph them, we shoot film, we also score everything. We have a band on stage, everything is scored live, kind of like a movie soundtrack. We integrate theatricality, so sometimes there are moments of dance, moments of other performance. We had a reporter from the New York Times do a piece about technology and memory where she was presenting it in collaboration with a really innovative shadow theater company from Chicago where they animated the narrative of her story live on stage with shadows. And we've expanded from that into doing other kinds of physical installations, putting journalism and storytelling in different and sometimes unlikely contexts, audio experiences. We do some more familiar work too. We've done some print journalism. We won a Pulitzer Prize last year for some reporting in a print magazine that we made. And increasingly a lot of partnerships, both with other media companies and brands. So that is Pop-Up Magazine in a weird nutshell.
Thank you. Robin.
Thanks, Renee. Hi, everybody. I'm Robin. I'm new formats editor at the Wall Street Journal. What that means in practice is that I sort of lead and oversee 3 teams at the moment. So the newsletters team, our rankings team, so best US colleges, most popular Oscars movies, which was actually a ranking that we did just before the Oscars ceremony, and also the audience voices team, which handles comment moderation underneath our articles and other forms of audience engagement. So I got this job around September of last year, and before that, I actually also had a job title that had innovation in it. So I joined the journal originally in December of 2019 as Newsroom Innovation Chief, and I led a team of 4 developers, and we worked with designers and program managers to create prototypes of new tools, new formats, new features, new sort of, just testing out new ideas of different things, and I'm sure we're gonna get a little bit more into that as we continue the conversation.
Thank you. And I also don't have innovation in my title, but I've always worked across innovation. Just to say a bit about what I do, I won't speak much, but I could, only because I, like Chris, started at the Financial Times about 7 years ago as the first head of audience and insights, which by definition was innovative at the time because it was a job that had never existed, and probably almost all of us have jobs that never used to exist. So what I do today is look after almost any kind of content or journalism at the Financial Times that wasn't traditionally text. So that includes newsletters as well, and audio and podcasts, and topic hubs, which are, again, a new way of trying to curate and deliver and make discoverable our content. And also, additionally, and this is sort of probably in and of itself a strand of innovation about how we do journalism and how we develop it, I also think a lot about how to monetize this journalism from within the newsroom. So making money is actually an integral part of how I think about what we are pioneering, and that is also something that can be a bit interesting and controversial. But what I wanted to sort of put to maybe actually Robin as a first question to you is this question of what the real purpose of innovation is. I mean, you guys should feel free to jump in. I see innovation as being absolutely imperative to stay viable, right? We all know, and we're all here because journalism has been for a while now in the throes of transformation, and there's an urgency around how to continue making it a viable business in a world that's being disrupted. And goodness knows the past couple of years have never made disruption more real and immediate and unpredictable. But that's just one way of seeing innovation. For me, it really is a way of inventing the future and a real future that can be the way of properly doing journalism. For other people, it can have different functions, and other media can have different functions. So I kind of wanted to hear from you guys how you think about what the actual purpose of innovation is.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. Yeah, I absolutely agree. There's sort of innovation can mean lots of different things to different people, but there's one quote that I really like, and I came prepared for this question, which comes from this little pamphlet, if you'll indulge me for a sec, called Notes on the Role of Leadership and Language in Regenerating Organizations. And it's a little pamphlet written by a couple of guys that worked at Sun Microsystem for years and years and years. And in this pamphlet, what they say is, an organization is a set of conversations between people. These conversations are a living system. And by continually changing the language and its conversations, an organization may continually renew itself. And I really love that, even with the lights off. Is my microphone still on? I think so, yes, okay. Actually, so I really like that quote because I think one of the main functions of innovation, or people who work in innovation within an organization, is to introduce new language and introduce new sort of ways of conversing and introduce new questions into the organization and the conversation that it has with itself, with its customers, with its readers, with its audience. Part of why you want to do that, actually, like that just now was a really great example, is things happen. The industry is changing so quickly, and you need to adapt. And sometimes, you know, a disruption is a good thing. And yeah, I think that no matter how you set up your organization, there are usually some gaps that it's just not naturally set up to do well. So for example, you might have really efficient product teams, but they don't have the time and space to do product discovery. Or you might have reporters who are really, really focused on doing great reporting, but they don't feel like they have the time to get to understand their audience. And I feel like the type of innovation team that I ran and I enjoy and I like doing is the team that kind of identifies what some of those gaps are and tries to either fill it in themselves or to create the space for other people to fill in those gaps. That's how I kind of think about it.
That's interesting because you're both thinking about how to get out in front of disruption, right? So it's a question of viability, but also really thinking about what your user, your audience, and even just what might be pleasing or useful to them.
Yeah, I think so. I think sort of it's a big theme in sort of our industry and a lot of, well, maybe not sort of digital started, but certainly sort of the legacy media and the organizations that you and I both work at, that sort of getting a really good understanding of our audience and how it's changing and amidst new audiences that we're attracting is precisely one of those gaps often. And so a lot of innovation work, for it to be relevant, for it to be integral to the business, you have to go back to the customer at the end of the day or the user at the end of the day.
Yeah. Doug or Chris, did you guys want to sound in?
You know, we're small. We're a small company. You could fit most of us probably in a large van. It would be a little crowded and uncomfortable, but we could do it. And that means that we have to be interesting and we have to be surprising for anybody to pay attention. And so, you know, for us, a lot of what we're thinking about are ways that we can capture attention in a very noisy world, and how we can hold it, and how we can form memories. And that's something we talk a lot in our editorial meetings when we're thinking about both new stories, because we present stories in so many different ways, but also new products. You know, we all encounter so many bits of content over the course of a day, and most of it we'll forget. But the things that we remember stick with us. And those things add up and become part of our lives. And so if we can capture someone's attention and then make something that's surprising enough and interesting enough that they'll remember it, then we get to stick with them. And so for us, it's existential. And it's also a way for us to discover new opportunities because we're growing. And so we may try something new and it is not all that we hoped it would be, but we may try something new and discover an entire new line of opportunities that we didn't know existed. And it's hard to discover that in theory on a Zoom call, around a meeting table. You have to go out and try stuff and see what works.
It's really interesting, that aspect of you need to surprise them, you have to surprise them. I'm currently developing a new, it's a very imperial I, with a large team of really good collaborators, we're developing a new podcast, and we're doing it in co-production, and it's a new partnership for us. And our partners said that the way they approach doing something new that's news-based is really thinking always about insight and delight. And first of all, that rhymes, which is awesome. But I just find that it's very, very true. And that question of delight has become a little bit of a hackneyed term, but it's really true when thinking about why innovate. Yeah. Chris.
I think the word that kind of hovers above the word innovation and kind of haunts it a bit, I think, is novelty, you know? And so I guess when I'm thinking about innovation, what I'm thinking about is something that will be genuinely useful to the reader or the newsroom, or hopefully both, and that only we would do. And that second bit really matters to me. It's not just about whether it is new, but something that springs really organically from what The Guardian kind of represents and what its values are and how we approach journalism. And it's kind of informed, the reason I asked to do this role was because I started out in journalism. I was an actor, and like most bad actors, I needed a second job, and my second job was being an uploader for The Guardian Unlimited when it first started out, the online bit of The Guardian, and it was not in the main building, and it was a kind of warehouse kind of room split in two down the middle, and there were developers on one side and editorial on the other. And what I remember about that period, just really observing it, was the kind of constant conversation that was going on between those two groups, and the sense that both of them were rooted in the same kind of values and ideas, and both sides got each other to a certain extent. And I think as we've all grown, that's become a really difficult quality to capture and nurture. And so for me, innovation, every time I've been involved in something that I felt has innovated, it's always been a really specific problem from the newsroom, which has then been brought on by the skill of product and engineering into something, you know, realized and concrete and exciting. And about 4 years ago, I started to get worried because I kept seeing us do the same as other people, and it all started to feel a bit homogenous, you know? Website design all started to look the same, and so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to cross-pollinate those two groups. And my job really is to work on both sides of the equation. With editorial, I want us to adopt some of the rigor of product, think really carefully about what we're asking for, but take responsibility for some of that strategy. And on the product side, I want them to bend towards us a little bit as well. And we might get into that a bit later, but there are gaps, natural gaps for good reason between the way in which editorial and product work. And trying to massage those two things is what I'm trying and often failing to do.
That's the perfect transition, Chris, into the next question I want to ask all of you, actually. In fact, you'll have the good fortune of starting again then maybe, as soon as I can actually get back into my notes. Another question I want to ask. So that's sort of the theory, right, of innovation. That's how we think about it conceptually. It's the why. But really, what you want to know is the how, to some extent, right? How do you decide what to do? How do you decide what to start with? What are the things that you're going to try? How do you decide what's most important? And how do you decide what not to do? How do you resist the trends, the clubhouses, the Peach? Peach was a social media platform for about 5 minutes. You know, and part of that challenge is probably one of what you're able to get done in your newsroom, where the gaps are. So yeah, I will ask each of you that, but Chris, sticking with you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? What isn't innovation? And I would say we're getting to a point of maturity now, I hope, where for most news organizations, that doesn't include, for example, the latest feature rolled out on a big tech platform. And you know, there used to be a period of probably 10 to 6 years ago where whenever Facebook or anybody rolled something out, we would all jump on it and class it as innovation, which it isn't. One of our strengths, there was a lot of agonies around the skill of product teams in tech companies to innovate, bring new ideas, and so on and so forth. But one of our strengths, actually, and I think we're all starting to realize that a bit, is the journalism expertise. You only have to look at Facebook to see the trouble it's got into, for example, over the last few years. So we should be seeing that editorial expertise as a huge strength. And I think that's not always a natural thing in a product process. You know, it can often be relegated to a concept of a business need or, you know, these kinds of things. So one of the things I really want us to do is find interesting people in the newsroom with interesting problems. I want them to come to us and feel like they can come and articulate those things. And so the first part of my job was I did exactly that. I went around for quite a long time and I tried to pull together something that wasn't too prescriptive. I didn't just want to dump a list on the product team because I want them to be engaged and I want them to be able to help us solve problems, not just, you know, tell them to execute stuff. And we kind of boiled it down into 5 themes. And 2 of those themes were kind of things that I felt that were strengths for us, that I felt we could build on. And 2 were things I thought were not natural strengths. And then there was one in the middle, which frankly was a fudge, which is curation, which is just, it could pretty much cover anything if I'm perfectly honest, but it feels like something we should be worrying about.
Sort of like personalization.
Yes and no. It can involve personalization, although again, I think personalization tends to get thrown around a bit much because...
That's what I mean. It's one of those terms that can mean...
But yeah, exactly. How do we present things to people? How can we build on our natural skill in curating? You know, that's one of the reasons why people come to us is not because we necessarily personalize or tailor it to them, but because we offer them something wider to buy into as well. So yeah, the first thing we're focusing on is live blogs because it felt like a natural thing for us. We've always been at the forefront of it. It's a really embedded process in our newsroom. We love them, we're good at them. And actually, interestingly, I think with live blogs, it's you know, the purest digital format in some ways, and it also hasn't changed in 10 years, except where the journalists themselves are changing it. You know, the journalists have been amazing at developing new tones in live blogs. You know, you look at the difference between a cricket live blog at The Guardian and the Politics Daily live blog, and they're so wonderfully different. And so one of the things I want to do is we want to get into whether or not we can make a change in that respect around the actual product itself.
So it's interesting, Chris. It sounds like the place you start really is the core raw material, the journalism and the journalists.
Yeah, I think it's important, right? I think we've been through a couple of phases around product and editorial. The first one was anybody in editorial with a loud enough voice can shout and they will get it, even if it's bonkers, right? And there was brilliant stuff that came out of that. And again, at that period, the resource probably wasn't as big that you needed to devote to it. And then we brought product in to kind of professionalize that, bring in some rigor, bring really careful thinking about what the problem is, not just the solution. But to a certain extent, I feel like we just need to move those 2 things back together again. Mm-hmm. And I just want to get that sense of excitement around the idea of a journalistic kind of a concept or problem and see where we can run with it, basically.
Thank you. Doug, how do you think about what to do and what not to do when you're thinking about the next new thing?
So I want to take us back to a specific moment for us, which was the summer of 2020, when we had one of these big decisions in front of us. You know, most of our business at that time, most of our revenue certainly came from large scale live events, which over a period of about a month went from being called into question to being completely wiped out. So imagine you run an ice cream shop and ice cream is illegal. You have to figure out what you're going to do now. And that was the position we found ourselves in. And in the beginning, actually, I'm going to do something dangerous here and try to use the projector.
È possibile. Grazie.
So I'll fly through a handful of photos first to show you the sort of thing that we normally were doing before the pandemic. So this is what our live shows look like typically. Here's someone live painting a story. And so none of this was possible. So we did what everybody else did who had their business seriously disrupted. We started making some web videos, some pandemic web video. I think we did a pretty good job given the unbelievable constraints of sending around kits of cameras and teaching people how to record themselves. And someone described it to me as trying to direct a film by looking through a keyhole. They were telling people over Zoom, move to the left, move to the right, you're in front of a window, all that good stuff. And after a couple months of this, when we realized the pandemic was going to go on for a while, we thought, all right, do we want to become a web video company? Do we want to go up against the giants of web video who've put tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into getting great at that, who've built up massive scale on every video platform that you've could ever want to be on? Are we gonna enter that world? And so, when we think about what we're gonna do, we have to pick our shots because we are small. So we think, does it have a chance to be special? Do we think we can do the uniquely good version of it, or is there somebody else who could do a better version of it? Because if so, they should just do it. It shouldn't be us. And we think, is there something in this that we think we can replicate and turn into a new product? Or are we going to build some skills in this that we can apply to some adjacent things? Does it make sense for the business? So what we ended up doing was we created something called the Sidewalk Issue, which was our attempt to translate not literally what Pop-Up Magazine is, but the spirit of the kind of storytelling we do to a world where you can't gather indoors and where outdoor gatherings were too small to make any economic sense. So we created something kind of like a cross between a magazine and a scavenger hunt, where we installed stories in all different media around neighborhoods, a neighborhood in New York, a neighborhood in San Francisco, and a neighborhood in LA. And then we made this beautiful map, and the map was the table of contents. And you had to walk around the neighborhood and find the stories. So we did a piece about economic inequality as a giant graphic novel, and these were all up for about a month. This was in a big shopping district in San Francisco. We did a piece, we made a kind of a zine, a newspaper tabloid style zine that we did in collaboration with Hank Willis Thomas and his Four Freedoms Project that was mostly photo driven and all stories about love. So we were taking this, like this very familiar form factor and doing something very non-newsy with it and then putting it in a newspaper box on the street. We did a story about immigration told through the lens of food, and we printed it to look like a takeout menu and stuck it outside of a restaurant in 3 of the neighborhoods, a restaurant with a patient restaurant owner that allowed us to put a fake menu outside their restaurant. We had a vending machine where we asked a question to 4 different artists and had them paint their answers, and then we shuffled them all up and put them in the box, and you put in 2 quarters and you get an answer at random. So it's kind of like the live version of a editorial illustration. Did a video installation in a storefront. We had this on the left is a story about lost faith that we hung up as a lost and found poster, and you call the phone number on it and hear the person tell their story, which we produced like a radio piece. So none of this is a live show in a theater, but we felt like we had a good chance to do the best version of it. And a lot of what we do with our live shows is try and figure out things that we haven't done before. And so we were able to make something that felt true to what we do, but also entirely new. And we see at least 2 or 3 other, product or partnership opportunities that could grow out of the work.
So Doug, quick follow-up question. That sounds like a real success in terms of having been put up against a crisis, really, and then sort of taking the experience of the original product, the ice cream, and recreating some of the experiences of ice cream, but not ice cream. Of course, when you're selling ice cream, or like a theater, sorry?
Sorbet. Or
yeah, exactly. When you're, to end the ice cream metaphor, when you're producing a live theater event, you sell tickets. To ask the really boring Philistine question, how do you make money from that?
Well, so we created this as a free event because we looked at all sort of different ways of ticketing outside, and there are ways to ticket outside, but not at the kind of scale that we needed to attract meaningful sponsorship. And so when we looked at the trade-offs between something like our live shows, which is a mix of sponsorship and ticket revenue, versus something entirely sponsor-driven versus something more intimate that would be primarily ticket-driven but wouldn't really have a pitch to sponsors. I mean, sure, you could do some hybrid things with video, but then again, you get back into the question of not wanting to become a web video company at that moment. So we pitched it to Google, which has been a sponsor of a number of our projects, and they were the lead sponsor of it.
Got it.
So
So,
that made it-
sponsorship.
Yeah, so that made sense as a business opportunity. There was a kind of like a native, like a live version of a native ad, which we do in the shows too, but an installed Google story, which you
Right.
could find on the map.
So in some ways, you adapted your traditional business model to a new kind of product. Thank you. Robin, how do you think about what to do and not
Yeah,
to do?
well, at this point, I just want to hear more about Douglas and
I know.
and how they're adapting.
I know.
But so when I was working on the innovation team and a new project idea came our way, we would basically have a list of questions that we would just ask ourselves. And so the first of those questions is, does this actually pose a broader question, or is it just doing a one-off for something? So instead of, hey, we should do something really interesting and unique to tell this story because it has loads of, for example, audio transcripts, and let's figure out what's the best way of telling this story with audio transcripts, that's not interesting to us. What's interesting to us would be, is there a reusable way of really presenting audio transcripts to our readers because they don't appear just in this story, they appear in dozens of stories that we do across many different topics. So I think it has to meet this sort of first bar of being able to at least sort of allow us to ask a broader question either about format or process or reader interaction or engagement. The second question that we ask ourselves is, does this tie into our overall strategic goals? So our newsrooms, like any others, has big strategic goals. Most of them are pretty common sense. I can't go into huge detail about what they are, but basically we want our journalism to reach more people, and we want people who read our journalism to come back more often. And so when we do a new project, I don't necessarily have to fully sketch out every step down to percentage increase in numbers of how this will contribute to some of these, but I at least have to be able to have a story in my head about how, if this really works, then these are some of the ways in which I can see how it would contribute to our strategic goals. And if I can't even sort of craft that story in my head, then we're going to be in trouble if it takes off, and so we don't do it. The third question is perhaps a little bit surprising, which is anyone on my team excited about this? Because we have a small team, and people have preferences, and people like to work on different things.
Speaks a bit to what Chris was also
Yeah.
mentioning earlier.
And innovation is hard, projects are hard, you don't really want to get halfway through a project with someone and then have your team just be like, we're just really tired of this and we don't want to do it. And so we really sort of ask ourselves, is at least one of us really excited about doing this project? And then the last question is, and that's partly because of the nature and the setup of our team, do we have a partner, basically? So we did about, in the year and a half where I did the team, we had 20-odd projects. Every single one of them was with another team. It was either with another reporting desk or bureau, or with a product team, but so we always work with others, basically.
Interesting. One aspect in particular, because it is an echo of when we worked together. You used to be at the Financial Times on different roles, but in part on the interactive team and the data journalism team. And when in the newsroom we would go to the interactive team and ask for a cool interactive, the question would usually be, is this repurposable? Is it scalable? Are you thinking about that bigger question that you mentioned? Is it going to solve a bigger problem? Which kind of leads me to the action.
Can I just come in quickly?
Yeah.
So yes, but we were able to stake that position because at the Journal there is a very talented and very large visual storytelling team. So if you have a story that has lots of audio transcripts, you think it's going to be great, you really want just a one-off way of really presenting that story really well, let me introduce you to Shazna, who's actually at Persia today. So we were able to take that position because there were other people and other teams that handled some of the other newsroom demands.
Right. That is exactly, leads me to the next question I wanted to ask you in particular, which is, all right, you're in a very large organization, which, to sort of cite at least only just what you've said here, actually has quite a lot of resource, maybe relative to other organizations. Certainly at the Financial Times, nothing has changed. Is it still scalable? Is it still reusable? So I guess the question I want to ask you in particular, where the business model of your publication, like mine, is explicitly for profit, to what extent do resources actually inform what you decide to do or not to do? Can you be as blue sky as you want? Do you allow yourself to be? Or are you always thinking about, well, actually, we don't have the resources to do this. We can't do it. We might want to do it, but we just can't.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bit to unpack there because I think there's sort of different elements to it. On one hand, there is definitely a resource constraint because quite literally there were 4 developers on my team, and so that's the finite number of people on a team that you can do things with. But actually, one of the bigger challenges, or I suppose one of the more unique challenges to do with large organizations, is to do with scaling something that is successful. So the trouble doesn't actually come when we experiment with a bunch of things and they don't really work, and then we don't generally actually end up feeling like we've wasted our time as a result. The hard part comes when we experiment on something, or we prototype something, we try a new idea, and we think it holds really real potential, both either business-wise or audience-wise or journalism-wise, and we really want that to then spread and scale and be properly and fully developed. Either just sort of staffing in terms of building it out, or because we built the prototype deliberately in a way that is not scalable because we want to do it quickly and test an idea. And that, I think, is one of the really big challenges that innovation.
Have you, in the context where you really have resource constraints and you can only do what you can do, have you ever made a mistake? What's been a mistake you've made about something you tried and it just didn't work out? And is there something that you've learned from that or taken away from that?
Yes.
I really wanted you to say no.
I'm smiling because it was really fun. Sometimes the things that at some level are a mistake were fun at the time. So we had this was a few years ago. We did this, we basically opened a restaurant for one night. And we had this notion of, it was animated by the question, what if a restaurant was a magazine? Which may not be a question that lots of people think about. But when you're in the live magazine business, you spend a lot of time thinking about what if whatever was a magazine. So we thought, what if a restaurant was a magazine? And we got very excited. And a good friend of ours, Samin Nasrat, got very excited too. She's an amazing chef and author and Netflix star and all of those things. So we decided we're gonna do it. We had a lot of good ideas, and we said yes to all of them. And we said yes to some borderline ideas too. It was so over the top. I mean, we like sound design, we had projection, like the menus were like physical pop-up books. We had a story about agriculture and oil drilling, where we had everybody's salad plates fabricated from the mud used to lubricate oil drill bits, food safe. And over, like, so many of those things.
Yeah.
Some of the things were very simple. You know, we did a thing about drought using everybody's water glasses, where we drew on the glasses of the historical highs of reservoirs in the west, and then only filled the water glasses up to the level they were then, which was like such a wonderful, simple illustration of an idea. We also did some things that were incredibly complicated, and
This sounds great. What's wrong with this?
it was a magical night. Everything went remarkably smoothly, more smoothly than it had any right to go. We actually had this incredible spreadsheet. Where
Dreading the butt.
The butt is coming, and probably some people see it coming. We had this spreadsheet with the run of show for what was going to be like a 3-hour plus multi-course experience, where we had it like blocked down to sort of 2-minute intervals, both of editorial cues and multimedia cues, and when dishes were supposed to arrive, and so it worked. And we spent way too much money. And it was fine. I mean, we didn't, the company didn't go under. But we spent too much money, and we should have known it. Because there was only so much we could monetize this. And we were doing it a little bit as a test of a model. So we wanted to test a bunch of different things. It wasn't irresponsible. We were trying to test way too much at once, and make something that was a real showpiece that we thought we might be able to replicate. And instead we exhausted ourselves and said, well, we're never gonna do that again. And the sales team would ask us about it periodically, because sponsors heard about it and were intrigued, and we're like, oh, no, too much, too tiring. And now actually I think we may come back to it. We've started having a serious conversation about, enough time has passed that we can look at it with some distance and say, all right, it was a good idea, we just went overboard. So let's come up with, like, what's the practical, streamlined, still magical, but like actually like an idea we can execute.
Yeah. That leads me to sort of one kind of fundamental, deeply unsexy tenet that I also think of when thinking about innovating. And I know Robin and Chris, you and I have talked about this a lot, that innovation is often actually, in order to be implementable and work and be successful, is not the sexy new thing. Sometimes it's not a new thing. It's a new version of something. It's a simple piece of one greater thing. And yes, you probably can do everything, but not all at once. And it sounds like maybe you take one chapter of that magazine and you produce that. I'm a little bit conscious of time, and I want to make sure we leave some time for questions. But I wanted to ask each of you, actually this is a question to some extent you've already answered, Doug. So what is the one sort of big thing you have worked on recently, or that you're working on now, in terms of innovation or in terms of something new? Robin.
Oh gosh. Okay. Working on so many new things. Let me see. One of the really big questions that I have that I'm trying to answer is that we roughly know what the big channels of distribution are for our journalism, for our content. So is our websites, is our search, is there actually a new one that can be created at scale? Is it newsletters? Because I now oversee the newsletters team. Or is it something else? But I just think that, to me, some of the more interesting things are starting to happen in areas where you can find new channels of distribution, new ways of relating to audiences, and there's loads of stuff that are utterly fascinating happening at the scale of a couple hundred people, a couple thousand people, but is there one thing that can work at a couple million people? And I don't have the answer for that. But if anyone does, I would love to talk to you.
Is there a concrete example of like a topic or Or
Yeah, well, so one of the things we did with newsletters recently is to treat it not just as as an epistolary, as a sort of a columnist or a person writing to you about what they're going on, but as a way of structuring learning, of doing a structured learning experience for people. And so we created these automated email courses that you could sign up at any time, and we would teach you over the course of 5 weeks about personal finance, about investing, about fitness, and that's been a really sort of fascinating way of using email in a slightly different way than newsletters traditionally, and thinking about sort of how do we, now that we've done a few of them, sort of can they be expanded? You know, can they become a whole suite of courses that we do? So something like that, yeah.
interesting. So again, not like newsletters, old is new again, but
Yeah,
you've made
yeah.
it quite a different utility for newsletters in innovating it. Chris.
Speaking of old is new, I'm a gamer, and I love the way Nintendo do this, right? They're always really interesting. They talk about using withered technology. So they're not like, I don't know, Microsoft or Sony, always, building in the newest graphics card or what have you. When you look at something like the Wii, right, it was incredibly old technology. They just applied it in a way that only they would. So I think that's a really important thing is, don't have a blockchain strategy. Use blockchain if anybody ever finds a use for it that's actually relevant. In terms of what we're doing, I talked about it a little bit, live. And the thing that I'm interested around live is live blogs are amazing. They drive huge audiences. We know that they are a gateway to new audiences as well because of the way that they will be prominent in search, because they're bringing very, very up-to-the-minute events to readers. But they're also, I think it's fair to say, monolithic, intimidating to a lot of people, overwhelming. And so we're thinking about ways in which we can mediate that and find a way for readers to get a foothold in them, especially if they're arriving late, right? You know that feeling of arriving in the middle of a live blog and it's like, Jesus, there's so much underneath. And I think there's quite a lot in that that's quite interesting because the quality of the journalism in there, the granularity of it should be of benefit to a wider audience. We're also looking at what we can understand from the data, right? If you're, again, from an audience background, you look at graphs around live blogs and you see these vast, kind of wonderful tundra of Google referral and direct referral. And when there's a goal in a live football match, you get this enormous spike and everybody high fives. But a lot of those spikes are people who know a goal has been scored and are clicking repeatedly to until the point your blog updates, So the data there is quite misleading, and I want to understand more about how people actually use them and where those spikes are in fact covering up some really unhelpful behaviors, basically.
Interestingly, it sounds like innovation in this case is optimization. You're not reinventing, you're not rebuilding, you're making it much more.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that will provide something really different. If we get it right, the nature of those live blogs and the nature of our live blog should feel quite distinct from other people.
Than it was when it was first launched.
Yeah.
Sure. Doug, you already told us a little bit about how you innovated in crisis. What are you working on now?
A bunch of things, but I'd answer this really simply, which is that something really new for us is seeing a lot of opportunity in partnerships. For a long time, we basically did our own thing. And we've started to see a lot of opportunity to work with larger media companies, to work with brands, to work with different sorts of collaborators to make things together, and it's really interesting. So that's definitely front of mind for us these days.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting actually, because you're only as potentially innovative as the ideas you get and can find, and we sometimes forget to look outside of our newsrooms or look outside of our journalists, or even look outside of our industries. We have 8 minutes left, which is quite a lot. Are there questions in the audience? And can you just say your name and your question, and I'll repeat it back? Please, right here in the front.
So I had a question about when you're looking to whether you're going to build it internally or if you're going to outsource it. How do you make that decision? And then how do you make that decision and make that balance between the two?
To repeat that question, it is the age-old but always important question of, do you build it or do you buy it? Who wants to take that one?
I can sort of take a first stab at it. So I ran a team that actually had developers on the team, and so our instinct was to build it. But it wasn't just because we were able to and therefore were biased towards doing it. It was because we defined our team's output not actually by the actual prototypes or things that we built, but by the insights that we learned from doing it. And so I think there is still a lot that can be learned from having gone through the process of having built it yourself. That is really helpful and useful and a large part of the value that we as a team actually brings. It is definitely not, so this is where I think there's a separation between sort of innovation and experimentation with actual new product development, because it is definitely not the most efficient way. It is definitely not like the best, the cheapest way, the most quickest, the most sort of cost-effective way to actually get the product out necessarily. But in our case, we were operating under the framework of we wanted to be able to ask and explore some questions, and the best way to do it is to get hands-on and to do it ourselves.
Chris?
Yeah, I could pick that up as well. If we were starting out tomorrow, we probably wouldn't necessarily build our own CMS, and we wouldn't necessarily have built OFAN. But I'm so glad we did in those examples, partly because we have amazing tools engineers who are really embedded in the newsroom. But it's also the flexibility that it gives you across the top sometimes to really move things. With OFAN, with the data tool, what was crucial to that was OFAN is a real-time data tool, but it's a culture change tool that happens to be a real-time data tool. So the data that we're pushing through into the newsroom is designed to promote positive action there and to change people's minds. And in that particular example, that flexibility has meant, I think, a really rich and different approach to data in the newsroom compared to some people who use off-the-shelf products. So I think there's huge value in it. But your point is a really good one. You can't build everything. You shouldn't build everything. You should know when somebody else can do it better than you and be humble about it.
In the back.
Hi, Isabel Cockrell. Chris, you talked about bending to product and sometimes getting product to bend to you as journalists. I wondered if one of you could tell us a story about when you bent product or reluctantly, or when they bent to you reluctantly, and did it work out?
Just to repeat the question, Chris had mentioned earlier this idea of making a product bend towards, I guess, an idea or a need. How do you make that decision, or how do you do that?
Yeah, so it's, I want both sides to bend to each other. Editorial have got to get into a position for me. A lot of my work is about saying, for God's sake, let's not have 27 people just chucking ideas over the top to product managers, and just going, we need this and we need that. And we need a coherent strategy. So one of the big things is trying to take responsibility for that on our side and really bringing together the things that we really do value and saying a clear no to the things that we don't really want. So being a more reliable partner, I think. It's really, it's really important, and you easily slip out of it. So that's the kind of bit that I want us to do. On the product side, I think it is about making sure that the process isn't the end point. Allow the processes to be flexible enough to allow things through that you can't necessarily put a number next to, for example. And also just being a little bit more careful around numbers. There's a it's often the case, especially when you're working on an editorial product, that people kind of go, it's an editorial thing, so let's measure engagement of readers. And it looks like common sense at the top, but it often isn't. For example, some of the things that we're trying to do with live blogs, we may well reduce the number of page views that we're generating. Now, you might be able to find a signal in increased engagement from those fewer page views, but it's not going to be easy. And again, everything's overshadowed by this huge news cycle, which is burying small changes in the numbers. So it's a bit, it's a bit like saying sometimes common sense is enough. Let's not argue a good idea into the ground just because we can't pin a number to it. Those are the two kind of most obvious examples, I think.
I think we have time for one or two other questions in the back there, and then if we have time in the front.
Laura Ray from PW. I'd like to know how the needs of your audience and the insights about your readers influence your innovations.
Great question. How do user needs and audience insights inform or influence innovations? Anybody want to take that? Actually, do you know, actually, I'd be curious if, Doug, I mean, and to some extent, we all work with data. We have data tools, we have data platforms because we have a text product. How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to say for live is one of the things that's interesting about it is you write a joke, and then you put it on stage and people laugh or they don't, and that's data.
Right.
And you have a whole arguments behind the scenes about, is this funny or not? And then you find out. And so you also get to go into the lobby afterwards and talk to people. It's something that it's really wonderful, that kind of contact, or in the case of the installations that we've done, just to go there. Nobody knows what I look like. Just walk around and see how people are interacting with things. Like, observe it. Are there points where they're getting confused? Are there places that are attracting more people than others? It's not perfect, but you can get some really interesting insights that way.
Mm-hmm. Robin, did you want to add to that?
I mean, it's a bit hard to answer because in a sense the answer is sort of everything. Like it underpins sort of all of what we're trying to do and what we're trying. But I guess I'll answer by saying that I don't think we do a good enough job at figuring out different ways of really understanding what those audience needs necessarily are. I think we increasingly have better data to see what people actually do when they come to our site and when they interact. I think in general, even sort of myself and people, we don't talk to readers enough, and finding ways to just directly sit down with someone and talk to them about, what is your news reading? What do you do when you wake up in the morning? When do you pick up the Wall Street Journal? When do you read? Do you come to our website? Do you use the app? I feel like having more of those conversations is useful.
Thank you.
Can I totally agree with what Robin said. We've got amazing UX teams at The Guardian who keep us honest as well, right? And I think that kind of user reaction is especially crucial if somebody in editorial has a hunch, right? You want to make sure that's going to pay off in some way. I think what I would say as well, though, again, in the same way that we also handle analytics data with care, that data needs to be handled with great care too. And you need to make sure you're asking the right question. Because again, if you fall into a trap with it, you could end up everybody building the same thing, right? So you want to enshrine this sense that you've got a bunch of editors who are genuinely experts at communicating with readers and do have the user's benefit in mind, although they could be a lot more rigorous about it and should think more about it. And then on the other side, though, you've got the people who can actually go to those users and pull that essential feedback in.
Chris, you said something which I really want to pull out from, out from what you've said as perhaps our conclusive words. Actually, I'm afraid we don't have time for a last question. It keeps us honest,
Yeah.
right? Audience, ultimately, that's what it comes down to, is the audience reaction. It can be as sexy, as shiny, as awesome, as expensive or not, but it needs to come down to that, and that's what probably should and does keep us all honest. We are done for the evening. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thanks to you guys.
Thanks. That was fun. Oh my God! I wasn't. Oh yeah. How are you doing?
Hi. How do you do?